50 votes. In a Senate of 100 members, that sounds like a majority. And on June 5th, Senator Mike Lee's election integrity amendment did receive 50 yes votes against 49 no votes. Then the official result appeared on the screen. Motion rejected. Not tied, not postponed, rejected. That is the paradox at the center of this story. President Trump's allies reached the number that most Americans instinctively associate with victory, yet the proposal still died before it could become part of the bill. But here is the first fact that every serious explanation has to get right. Those 50 votes were not a final vote to pass the House-approved Save America Act. They were votes on a motion to waive Senate budget rules during consideration of a reconciliation bill. That motion required 3/5 of the Senate, 60 votes, not a simple majority. So 50 was politically revealing, but procedurally insufficient. And there was not just one Save-related vote. Senator Lindsey Graham's version failed, 48-50. Senator Mike Lee's later version reached 50-49. The policy goal was similar, but each amendment ran into a different procedural objection. That distinction does not make the obstruction less important. It makes the accountability more exact. The real question is not simply, how did an unelected official kill a bill with 50 votes? The real question is, how did Democratic opposition, Republican defections, Senate budget rules, the parliamentarians' advice, and leadership choices combine to turn 50 votes into another America First defeat? Before examining the Senate maze, establish what the House-passed Save America Act actually contains. At its core, the bill would require documentary proof of United States citizenship when a person registers to vote in a federal election. The accepted routes include a passport, certain citizenship indicating real IDs, specified military records, or a government photo ID paired with qualifying citizenship documents such as a certified birth certificate or naturalization certificate. The bill also directs states to create an alternative process for an applicant who cannot present the listed documents. Under that process, the applicant signs an attestation under penalty of perjury and submits other evidence for an election official to evaluate. For voting itself, the legislation would create a national photo identification requirement for federal elections. A voter without the required physical ID could cast a provisional ballot and cure the issue within the stated period. For a ballot cast other than in person, the voter would generally submit a copy of qualifying photo identification or use a Social Security number and affidavit alternative when unable to obtain a copy after reasonable efforts. Military and certain accessibility-related voters receive exceptions. The bill also requires continuing state efforts to identify non-citizens on voter rolls, remove ineligible registrations, and provide enforcement mechanisms when officials knowingly violate the rules. Supporters see a simple principle: only citizens may vote in federal elections, so citizenship and identity should be verified through enforceable standards. That argument has broad public appeal. National polling has repeatedly found large majorities supporting government-issued photo identification at the polls. Critics answer that proof of citizenship is not the same as ordinary voter ID. They warn that citizens without ready access to passports, compliant birth certificates, name change records, or transportation to election offices could face real burdens. Both points belong in an honest analysis. The bill contains accommodations that its opponents sometimes ignore. It also creates documentation and implementation demands that its supporters should not dismiss. Now we can explain why none of that policy debate automatically translated into passage when the number 50 appeared. The Senate does not ask the same mathematical question at every stage. On an ordinary final passage question that requires a simple majority, 50 senators plus the vice president can prevail in a full Senate. But most major legislation can be stopped by a filibuster unless 60 senators vote for cloture. Budget reconciliation offers a different route. It limits debate and can allow legislation to pass by a simple majority. That is why both parties use it for major tax, spending, and debt legislation. But reconciliation comes with fences. Amendments must satisfy budget rules, committee jurisdiction limits, and germaneness requirements. A senator may raise a point of order against a provision that violates those restrictions. The sponsor can then move to waive the objection, but that waiver ordinarily requires 60 votes. That is exactly where the 50-vote headline becomes misleading if it is left unexplained. The Senate was not asking, do 50 senators support the underlying election policy? It was asking, will 60 senators suspend the applicable budget rules so this amendment may remain inside a fast-track reconciliation bill? 50 senators answered yes. 49 answered no. But the required number was 60, so the motion failed. The vice president could not rescue it with a tie-breaking vote because there was no 50-50 tie. And more importantly, the rule required 3/5 of senators duly chosen and sworn. A vice presidential vote cannot turn 50 into 60. Visualize the problem as 3 roads. Road 1 is regular legislation. The bill encounters the legislative filibuster and normally needs 60 votes to advance. Road 2 is reconciliation. A simple majority may be enough at final passage, but only provisions that survive the reconciliation restrictions can travel that road. Road 3 is a waiver or appeal from the budget objection. That road also demands 60 votes. Trump's allies were trying to use the second road. The amendment was stopped at its procedural checkpoint, and the attempted waiver sent them straight back to the 60-vote wall they were trying to avoid. Now examine the 2 votes separately, because combining them hides the most useful lesson. First came Senator Lindsey Graham's Amendment 5779 on June 4th. The motion to waive all applicable budgetary discipline received 48 yes votes and 50 no votes. 4 Republicans voted no: Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, Lisa Murkowski, and Tom Tillis. Joni Ernst did not vote. After the waiver failed, the point of order was sustained under the Byrd Rule provision covering material outside the jurisdiction of the committee that submitted the reconciliation title. In plain English, the election policy language did not properly belong in that committee's budget lane. Hours later came Senator Mike Lee's Amendment 5804. This time the waiver vote reached 50 yes and 49 no. Collins and Ernst were in the yes column. McConnell, Murkowski, and Tillis remained no. Michael Bennet did not vote. Yet the Lee amendment still fell because the required threshold was 60. The congressional record states that the point of order was sustained under Section 305, subsection B, paragraph 2 of the Budget Act, the germaneness requirement governing amendments during reconciliation. So the 2 votes tell 2 different stories. Graham's amendment faced a Byrd Rule committee jurisdiction problem and lacked even a simple majority of votes cast. Lee's amendment reached a numerical majority, but it still lacked the supermajority needed to waive a separate germaneness objection. That is why the cleanest on-screen summary is not merely the bill got 50 votes. The accurate summary is, one SAVE-related amendment received 48 votes and failed under a Byrd Rule objection. A second received 50 votes and failed under a germaneness objection. Both waiver motions required 60. The Senate's own records make the failure look less like a mysterious clerical veto and more like a layered procedural trap, one that elected senators knew existed before they voted. Now we reach the figure at the center of the outrage: Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough. She is unelected. She holds enormous practical influence, and her office advises the presiding officer, senators, and staff on Senate rules, precedents, agreements, and laws affecting floor procedure. That makes unelected gatekeeper a fair political description. But one woman personally vetoed the bill is not a complete procedural description. The parliamentarian gives nonpartisan procedural advice. A senator raises a point of order. The presiding officer rules. Senators may seek a waiver or challenge the ruling. Ultimately, votes in the Senate determine whether the chamber follows, waives, or changes its procedures. In normal practice, the presiding officer follows the parliamentarian because ignoring established precedent can trigger an appeal and a broader institutional confrontation. That gives her advice tremendous force. But the force comes from the Senate's decision to honor the rulebook and the precedent behind it. This matters because firing the parliamentarian by itself does not manufacture 60 votes. Replacing her with someone friendlier to the policy would not automatically erase the written germaneness requirement, the Byrd Rule, committee jurisdiction, or the legislative filibuster. A determined majority could try to reject the advice, establish a new precedent, change the rules, or restructure the legislation. Those are political choices with long-term consequences. Senate leaders have so far chosen not to cross that line. From an America First perspective, the frustration is understandable. An official whom no voter can remove can help determine whether a central presidential priority gets access to the only path requiring a simple majority. The factual credibility requires the second half of the sentence. She guards a gate that elected senators built, preserved, and can choose to alter. The parliamentarian influenced the route, put the accountability on 4 screens. Screen 1, Democratic opposition. On the 50-49 Lee vote, every voting member of the Democratic caucus opposed the waiver. Not one supplied the additional support needed to approach 60. Democrats argue that the legislation would burden eligible citizens and federalize election procedures. Whatever the stated reason, their votes formed the largest and most unified bloc against the amendment. Screen 2, Republican defections. McConnell, Murkowski, and Tillis voted no on the Lee waiver. Collins had voted no on Graham's earlier attempt before voting yes on Lee's. These were not merely symbolic disagreements. In a closely divided Senate, every Republican defection widened the gap and weakened the political claim that the conference had delivered total unity behind President Trump's priority. Screen 3, Procedural enforcement. The parliamentarians' advice, the points of order, the Byrd Rule, germaneness, and the 60-vote waiver threshold closed the reconciliation route. The rules converted a policy majority into a procedural minority. Screen 4, Senate leadership. Majority Leader John Thune voted yes on the amendments. He has also kept the bill on the floor and forced votes. But he has resisted President Trump's demand to end the filibuster or pretend that dismissing the parliamentarian would solve the arithmetic. Thune's answer is that the votes do not exist for the bill, for the workaround, or for the rules change. That explanation may be procedurally realistic, but it is politically unsatisfying. We do not have the votes, describes the obstacle. It does not tell America First voters how leadership intends to overcome it. The final blame, therefore, cannot rest on one staff official. Democrats opposed the policy. Republican holdouts denied unity. Procedural officers enforced the existing restrictions. And Republican leaders chose institutional continuity over a high-risk rules confrontation. Each layer mattered. Remove only one, and the bill could still remain blocked by the others. That brings the dispute into the open. President Trump versus the Senate's institutional math. Trump has treated the Save America Act as a defining election integrity priority. He has pressed Thune to keep the Senate in session, terminate the filibuster, or find another route instead of leaving Washington with the bill unfinished. The president's argument is political and direct. Republicans control the chamber. Voters were promised action. A rule that allows a minority to stop a citizenship verification bill should not become an excuse for permanent surrender. Thune's answer is procedural and defensive. Republicans hold a majority, but not 60 seats. He says the conference does not have enough votes to pass the measure under existing rules, does not have enough votes to abolish the filibuster, and does not gain those votes merely by replacing the parliamentarian. He has repeatedly asked proponents to show him a path that ends in victory, rather than another failed roll call. Both men are identifying a real problem from different directions. Trump is right that leadership cannot advertise control and then act powerless whenever Senate tradition obstructs the agenda. A majority party that never converts its mandate into results eventually teaches its voters that elections change the names but not the outcomes. Thune is right about one narrower point. Anger cannot substitute for arithmetic. Firing an advisor does not automatically turn 3 Republican no votes into yes votes, win Democratic support, or eliminate every procedural objection. The America First criticism should therefore be sharper than a personality feud. The failure is not that Thune cannot magically produce 60 votes. The failure is that the conference has not agreed on which institution it values more when the two collide: the filibuster as a future defensive weapon, or the immediate ability to enact the election rules its voters were promised. That is the decision Republican senators are avoiding when they blame only the parliamentarian. A persuasive pro-Trump argument should confront the strongest objections instead of pretending they do not exist. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. Critics therefore ask whether a sweeping new documentary system solves a widespread problem or creates a much larger access problem for lawful citizens. Research cited in the debate estimates that a significant share of registered voters do not have ready access to the most common document combinations contemplated by federal proof of citizenship proposals. That can include citizens with expired passports, hard-to-replace birth records, inconsistent names after marriage or adoption, limited transportation, or insufficient time to visit government offices. The House-passed bill tries to answer some of those concerns. It includes an alternative evidence process for citizenship, affidavits for certain discrepancies, provisional ballots for voters lacking photo ID, and a non-photocopy alternative for some mail voters. Those protections are real and should not be erased from the discussion. But implementation questions remain real too. Election officials would have to train staff, redesign systems, communicate new requirements, process alternative evidence, protect sensitive data, and resolve mistakes without wrongly excluding eligible citizens. Here is the America First answer. Verification and access do not have to be enemies. Congress can require citizenship proof while also funding free documents, rapid record replacement, mobile assistance, secure database verification, clear name change rules, adequate implementation time, and strong due process protections for citizens incorrectly flagged. The conservative objective should not be to make lawful voting difficult. It should be to make eligibility verifiable, fraud punishable, and compliance practical for every qualified American. That is a stronger defense than claiming that every citizen already possesses perfect paperwork. It addresses the legitimate burden argument without surrendering the principle that American elections belong to American citizens. So, what are the remaining routes? First, regular order. Build a coalition large enough to overcome the filibuster. That is the most institutionally conventional path, and under the current alignment, the least likely. Second, change the filibuster rule or create a narrow election integrity exception. That could open a majority path, but it would require Republican unity that does not currently exist, and would create a precedent a future Democratic majority could use for its own priorities. Third, force a more visible, talking filibuster confrontation. That may increase political pressure and clarify who is obstructing the bill, but it does not automatically erase the cloture threshold at the end. Fourth, redraft the proposal into narrower pieces. A tightly written voter ID measure, document access funding, citizenship database verification, or targeted grants to states may attract different coalitions and face different procedural treatment. The House has explored a budget framework using billions in voting-related grants, though Senate leaders say that route also lacks sufficient support at present. Fifth, redesign the reconciliation language so its spending and budget effects are central rather than incidental. That might preserve some election integrity infrastructure, but reconciliation is unlikely to carry the entire regulatory system exactly as written. Sixth, challenge the procedural advice and attempt to establish a new Senate precedent. That is the most aggressive institutional option. It would require a majority willing to accept the immediate and future consequences. Seventh, make the obstruction an election issue. Name the votes accurately. Separate the 48 to 50 Graham vote from the 50 to 49 Lee vote. Explain which senators opposed which waiver, what threshold applied, and what leadership chose not to change. America First voters do not need a fairy tale in which one bureaucrat secretly controls the republic. They need a receipt showing where every elected official stood and which rule each one was willing to defend. Here is the verdict. President Trump's Save America agenda did not reach final passage with 50 votes, and then get personally vetoed by Elizabeth McDonough. A Lee amendment carrying the central citizenship and voter ID policy received 50 votes on a motion to waive budget rules. The motion required 60 and failed. A separate Graham amendment received 48 votes and failed under a different reconciliation objection. The parliamentarian mattered because her office's advice shapes how the Senate applies the procedural rulebook. But she did not act alone, and she did not create the vote count. Democrats supplied near-unified opposition. Republican holdouts prevented full conference unity. The Byrd rule and germaneness requirements closed the fast-track route. The 60-vote threshold made a numerical majority insufficient, and Senate leadership declined to detonate the rules in order to force the policy through. That is the deeper story, and it is more damaging than the simplified version. The problem is not merely that an unelected gatekeeper has influence. The problem is that elected senators preserve a system that allows them to campaign like a majority, govern like a minority, and then point at procedure when the promised result never arrives. President Trump is justified in demanding an answer stronger than the votes are not there. But the answer must be a real strategy: win the votes, rewrite the bill, change the rule, or accept responsibility for preserving the barrier. 50 votes expose the system. They did not defeat it. The question for Republican senators is now unavoidable. Is protecting the legislative filibuster more important than delivering the election integrity law they told voters was essential? And the question for you is just as direct. Should Republicans preserve the filibuster and keep searching for 60 votes, or create a narrow majority path to pass the Save America Act? Put your answer in the comments, and subscribe to America First TV for analysis that supports President Trump without abandoning the facts.